Hello, Chris again. In this video, we are going to plan out our low poly for the NES controller. Now, just like we did before we started modeling the high poly, we want to kind of think about how we want to approach modeling the low poly. And before we get started, it's a good idea to think about the number of pieces you're going to have and what is going to bake down to the low poly from the high poly. So the biggest thing that I'm going to bake will be these button frames and this indentation on the front. And then we'll be baking some other stuff like the indentation, the scoop here on the A and B buttons. So for this front panel, other than the buttons, I'm going to have one piece. And this one piece will include, here, 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 and here. All of this will be baked onto it. So this will just be one plane here. Then I'll have another piece for the D-pad and another piece for which I will duplicate for the select and start button. And then I'll have another piece which I will duplicate for the A and B button. And then another piece for the cord. And then we'll have one more piece for the plug, possibly two, which will be up there. We'll do that last. So we want to make sure that we have an understanding of the number of pieces and what is going to bake onto what, so that when it comes time to bake, we can think about the naming convention and what pieces in the high poly need to be combined. And we'll talk more about this later, but this is an important process to think through. So here we are back in Maya, and right now, if I turn the grid on, you'll see that the cord and plug are cutting through the floor. So first thing I'm going to do is lift the controller up so that the bottom of the controller is resting on the grid. I'm going to hit D to unlock the pivot and then vertex snap it to the bottom, and then I'll hold X and move this down to snap it to the grid. Next, the cord is floating, so let's go ahead and fix that. I'll select the cord in vertex mode. I'll select a bunch of these vertices, hit B for soft select, adjust the radius, and then move this down so that it's resting on the grid. Notice how it's giving a gradual decline where the cord is coming to the controller. Next, I'll grab the plug and make sure that this is on the ground. So I'm going to hit D to unlock the pivot, vertex snap it to the bottom here, hit D again, and then just grid snap to make sure this is actually on the grid. Then I'll go back to the cord, go to vertex mode, select these vertices with soft select on, and then move them up. I'm going to increase my soft selection by holding B and right click and dragging, or left click and dragging, sorry. I'll make some other minor adjustments so that this isn't so perfect. And that's starting to look pretty good. Now we need to create the low poly, and instead of duplicating these pieces which have a ton of edges on them, I'm going to import an old save. So I'll go to File, Import, and I want to get the save that has the controller before I added edge loops to it to smooth it. For me, that was save 8. Now I'm going to look at my outliner, and I'm going to clean this up a bit, find pieces that are nested, and then hold the middle mouse button, click and drag them out, delete empty nodes like that. Deleting history is often a good idea. If you delete a node and the object disappears, that just means you need to delete your history. Once it's cleaned up, I'm going to select all those pieces, then hit Control G to group them. Now I can select the group in the outliner. I'm going to center the pivot, and we want to put this exactly on top of the other controller. So I will rotate it 90 degrees, move it up, Then I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded, hit D to unlock the pivot, and I'll vertex snap it to a point that I know I can snap on the high poly. Then I'll hit D. So I know that vertex there is the same location as this vertex on the high poly. So I'll just hold V and vertex snap it into place. And I'll rotate around and make sure things are looking pretty good. So minor adjustment. I'll select the select and start buttons, and I made an adjustment earlier, so I'll just move those up to match the high poly. And I'll select the whole group, and I want to I'm going to delete this old layer first, and I'll delete this one as well. I want to put this in a new layer, so with it selected, I'm going to put it in a new layer and rename this layer, and I'll name this mid poly. Then with it selected, I will freeze the transformations by clicking on the snowflake, so that if I ever move it, I can just type in 0 in the channel box and it'll go back to its spot. So let's select the group and then move it to the side so we can work more easily. I'm going to select this front panel here, hit just this front panel. I'll hit Control 1 to isolate it. Then I'll create a plane, and I'm going to open up the inputs and change the subdivisions to 1 on the width and height. Then I'll move this over, and then I'm just going to select edges and use vertex snapping to snap this to the same size as the overall shape of the original front panel. So again, we're just making a replacement for this. This will be the low poly version, which will just be a single plane. I'll center the pivot, and then I'll vertex snap this to the same height. Make sure it's on the same height. And then we will select the original one, and we're going to delete it. We'll hit Control 1. I should have something like this. Now I'm going to delete these frames here because those will be baked on. Next, let's go ahead and create the low poly for the D-pad. So I'll isolate it. I'll delete these edges by holding Control and hitting Delete. And I'm going to essentially be using a combination of the target weld tool and the multi-cut tool, and deleting edges when I'm creating and optimizing all of these pieces. So the goal is to essentially weld points in such a way that you can then delete edges and get rid of them to reduce our poly count. Right now this piece is around 594 triangles, and we want to reduce that. So now that I've triangulated all those, I can go through, select all of these, and once I have them all, I can hold Control and hit Delete, and that reduced our poly count by about 200 triangles. We don't need these bottom faces, so I'll delete those. And I'm going to go ahead and triangulate in here as well. And I think I'll end up leaving everything else the way it is. Next, let's do the select and start buttons. Just going to select this edge ring and go to Edit Mesh, Collapse. And that's good. I can triangulate here and here using the target weld tool to reduce our poly count further. If you accidentally triangulate like that you don't want, just undo. I can duplicate this by hitting Control D, and then I'll hit D again, and I will move the pivot point. and then I will vertex snap it over there. Oops, Control D, and then vertex snap it. Then I'll delete the old one. Now that that's deleted, let's do the B and A buttons. So I'll isolate this by hitting Control 1 and zoom in, go to edge mode, and double click on some edge loops. And then hold Control and hit delete, which will flatten it out. I'm going to delete this edge too as well by holding Control and hitting delete. And then I'll grab this middle vertex and vertex snap it to the top so it's perfectly flat. Then I'll delete, I will delete that one soon, but first I'm going to duplicate this by holding Control and D and vertex snap it to the center where that button is, and then I will delete that button. And we have the first part prepped for the low poly, and in the next video we'll continue.